Essentially what Paul is saying, that when the brain it's the brain that actually sees rather than the eye. He explains it quite simply by explaining the fact that when the image arrives at the retina, it is then changed by the central nervous system into nerve impulses, little impulses. And those impulses travel from behind the retina through the central nervous system to the brain. And the brain actually recreates or gives us a representation of what is out there. So in a sense, it's a virtual representation of what we see. And that was what interested Paul. Now, taking that aspect with sensory substitution, since all of our senses work the same way, that sense of touch, smell, when the information reaches us, it changes into nerve impulses. It matters not whether it's sight or sound, or all of it changes into nerve impulses, which then travel to the brain, and the brain determines what those impulses mean and transfers them and translates them accordingly.
Have you ever heard about these scientific things before, or since you are connected with this work?
My interest, actually, in addition to the fact that it was a friend of mine who was doing this extraordinary work, I had been on my own little personal, I guess, exploration, you could call it, for well over 30 years. And that was due to my association initially with a man named Mr. J. Krishnamurti, whom I met in 1969. And then he in turn introduced me about 4 years later to Professor David Bohm. Mr. Krishnamurti was, he passed away in 1986, he didn't like these terms, but he was considered a philosopher, a real term he truly hated, or a spiritual leader, and which he absolutely condemned. But the point is that he spoke for many years about one thing: our inability to look at the manner in which the thinking process is distorted by the way the brain works at this point in our development as a species. And essentially what happens is that it creates an element of self-deception, because we take all of that conditioning which we pick up from the time we are children, and when we see something out there, what we see is then must pass through that conditioned mind, and it is through that conditioning that we then interpret it. So all of those things are not, well, let me put it this way again. This thinking process, he has suggested, and in fact it's a fascinating thing to think about, that most of us think that we create the thinking process. I create my thoughts. But he suggests quite the opposite, that thought creates me.